A surprise result comes out of the Chicago city election, and they're still talking taxes at the State House. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. We had a big election somewhere in the state this last week. We'll talk about it. Here to discuss that and State House issues with me, Hannah Meisel is back. She is State House reporter for the Daily Line. Welcome back.
Glad to be here.
And Kent Redfield is back, Professor Emeritus of Political Science, University of Illinois, Springfield. Kent, your knowledge is welcome.
Good to be here.
Okay. Well, we don't often start the show with what happened in an election in Chicago, but of course there are a lot of people there. There are close to 3 million people live in the city of Chicago. And we had somewhat of a surprise, as perhaps not a surprise. Toni Preckwinkle is a former alderman who for some years has been president of the Cook County Board, and she was one of the 2 top finishers in a field of, was it 14 candidates? For Chicago mayor in a primary on Tuesday. There was no primary, for example, in Springfield because you'd have to have 5 candidates for an office to schedule a primary. We didn't have that here. We're all going to the April 2nd nonpartisan election. But in the city of Chicago, if anybody had gotten 50% of the vote, they would have been elected on primary day last Tuesday. But as it turned out, both under 20%, you had Lori Lightfoot and Toni Preckwinkle. And Lori Lightfoot is, I believe, a former prosecutor who also headed a board overseeing the police department actions.
Police Accountability Board,
Police
yes.
Accountability Board. So there were people in that election that we know, like Susana Mendoza, like Bill Daley, who was brother and son of former mayors of Chicago.
Former governor, gubernatorial candidate, briefly, 2013.
At least he stayed in this race. And former, chief of staff to President Obama, I believe, for a while. So, Hannah, you and your organization were watching the election pretty closely. Surprising, Lori Lightfoot kind of had a lot less money than some people and kind of came out of nowhere versus these political heavyweights.
Yeah, it was a really interesting election. I mean, at one point in the late fall, we had something like 20-something candidates throwing in their hat. It was pared down to 14 after petition challenges. But, Lori Lightfoot really represents this new progressive wave that's we've seen taken over the city council and also has now trickled its way down to Springfield to a lesser extent. But, it was surprising because the way that the election was shaking out for some weeks, it seemed as if it was the establishment candidates who were really finishing toward the top. I mean, who would have expected another Daley to have come so close, because he finished third by only 6,000 votes. And if things could have, taken another turn, I mean, that's like not even a couple of city blocks coming out to vote. It's just very, very interesting. So yeah, we have it's historical because no matter who it is, on April 2nd, the city of Chicago will have its first black female mayor. And we just will find out her name.
That's right. Kent, how much should the state around Central Illinois care who the mayor of Chicago is?
Oh, I think it's huge. Whoever becomes the mayor of Chicago is a key player in Illinois politics. And whether we're talking about taxes or talking about a infrastructure plan and a capital bill, the interests of Chicago are always very, very important. They're sometimes not as important as a lot of downstaters think, but in terms of, Chicago just runs all of Illinois. But there's a tremendous amount of in terms of population, in terms of the economy. And this is an interesting situation because we have the Preckwinkle, who is the chairman of the Cook County Board, started out as a reformer, a progressive. She is probably around 70 now and has been in office for a while. And so she is used to managing a large governmental operation, has lots of political experience.
And as I recall, she's shares the Democratic Party of Cook County now, too.
Lightfoot has never held public office, and we're talking very small percentages here. 17% for the first place, 15% for second place, 14% for third place. And so a different configuration of candidates in terms of splitting the vote. Let's say we didn't have Mendoza and Gary Chico splitting the Hispanic vote, might have gotten a different outcome. We didn't have the Burke situation with the longtime alderman being indicted.
Ed Burke, who also, by the way, got more than 50% in a three-way race in his ward. So Alderman Ed Burke, despite the fact he's under indictment for allegedly trying to get business on the side from people working with government, is reelected to another term on the city council, where I think he's been 50 years already.
And so that, the corruption issue certainly played into Lightfoot's appeal in terms of her background as a reformer, although she has had some political administrative offices and stuff. Now, if she's elected, now you've got someone, a governor who's never held public office, and the mayor of Chicago who's never held public office. That's a very different scenario than having someone who's used to politics, used to making executive decisions. And so it could introduce a lot of uncertainty into a legislative session that already has a lot of uncertainty.
That's true.
And so knowing what Chicago wants may be much more difficult to determine, depending again on who wins that election.
Right. If we were looking this from an old-time perspective, you got Toni Preckwinkle. She actually got into some trouble, had to give back some money because there was a fundraiser at Ed Burke's home. Ed Burke's wife is Illinois Supreme Court Justice Ann Burke. So it's a well-known family. Ed's brother, Dan, was a state legislator who just got beat off the city council, I think a couple years ago, defeated. But Preckwinkle, she's got the party, she's got a lot of interests who might well be behind her. We don't know where Ken Griffin will go. He's the richest man in Illinois. He actually gave a couple $1 million to Bill Daley this time, which made opponents of Bill Daley link him to Governor Rauner, which didn't play well in Chicago, where Governor Rauner was not very popular. But Preckwinkle, again, would have that administration or the people in place to get the job done under the old machine politics of Chicago, even though, as Kent said, she was a reformer once. But boy, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, if that's the correct name, the new, from Queens, New York.
Bronx.
Well, I'm around there somewhere because I think my daughter lives in Queens and she represents her now. Defeated a very long time leader of Democrats in the U.S. House. I mean, these times are so weird. There are certain pockets of energy that we just don't know where. Lori Lightfoot would also be, I believe, the first openly gay mayor of Chicago. So you just don't know what's going to happen. So it's just an interesting time. Can we predict? Kent?
Oh, I think that's very difficult to do at this point. We don't know. The business community, which has had a long and been very favored in terms of having relationships with the mayor of Chicago, with both Daley's, with Rob Emanuel. We're backing Daley in this race, and it's not obvious exactly who they would, who would be the preferred candidate. Both of these candidates are going to be talking about much more about doing things in the neighborhoods than they are.
It's always a downtown versus the neighborhoods fight.
Versus the downtown.
From Harold Washington's days on.
So it is, we don't know where public employees are going to go. Lightfoot has been a person who's been identified with police reform.
Which is an ongoing, big issue in Chicago.
Yeah. Preckwinkle has the Chicago Teachers Union and the Service Employee Unions.
A lot of people knocking on doors there.
Yeah, and so but this is one of those things where it's going to be an interesting outcome. It will have all kinds of ripple effects in the rest of the state, but I don't know anybody that's saying with a lot of confidence today exactly how this is going to sort out.
Yeah, and Hannah, interestingly, I don't want to be unfair to her because I'm not always at the State House myself, but I haven't seen Susana Mendoza, our comptroller in Springfield, for a while, but she did not mislead voters. She didn't say she wouldn't run for mayor of Chicago right after winning re-election as comptroller last November. She did jump into the race, but things just didn't go her way. She was in, I guess, the top half, but not the ultimate top tier. So,
I think the surprise. I think people thought that she would do a little bit better, but again, she also had ties to Ed Burke. I saw a funny tweet the other night on election night that said, "So the only person who Ed Burke didn't hurt was Ed Burke himself."
That's right, because he won re-election, and yes, although Toni Preckwinkle didn't come in second, but she made it. It was the top two candidates, so she moved on.
And two African American candidates, whereas who did not do well in the wards that Chico or Mendoza did well in, and so. It's not only how does labor sort out, how does business sort out, how does the Hispanic community within Chicago sort out. There's just so many variables in terms of this. It's fascinating.
And it is interesting when you have so many candidates in a race. For example, I believe it was 2010 when there were like 6 or 7 Republican candidates for governor in Illinois, and Bill Brady of Bloomington, who is now the Senate Republican leader and represents part of Springfield, he became the nominee of the Republican Party for governor, getting about 20% of the vote in a primary. So it was very, there were people close to the top, but on they go, and then it becomes the big race. Well, speaking of what Mr. Brady might think, but what we know House Republicans think in Springfield, they don't like J.B. Pritzker's idea to have a graduated income tax. That was a major part of his campaign when he won by 16 points over Governor Rauner in November. J.B. Pritzker has yet to say what the brackets he would want to see as to if there is a progressive income tax where the rich pay more and the poor and middle class maybe pay less, or maybe not according to Republicans. We haven't seen the brackets. The governor says he wants to work with legislators on that, as he said during the campaign. He has also made it very clear that he wants the House and the Senate to get those extraordinary majorities soon, this spring, to put this issue on the ballot for next year, for November of 2020, because it has a constitutional amendment to get us off the flat tax and allow a graduated income tax in Illinois. Has to be an amendment to our Constitution. Hannah, I know that there were a bunch of House Republicans in the news conference room at the State House this week saying, we think, as we have, Pritzker's idea is a bad one, the flat tax is good to keep.
All 44 House
Republicans.
Hello. All 44 House Republicans have co-signed a House resolution in which they say I read the actual language. At some points it's kind of funny. They said something about Democrats living in a make-believe world.
So they're trying to make a little political point here as we go.
I mean, their argument is that, a progressive tax, it might sound good that Illinois would only tax the wealthiest people more, and then the middle class and working class people get a tax break. But they point out that, some states who already have, a lot of states already have progressive income tax structures, but they say that a lot of states, either their progressive income tax structures are effectively flat because there are so little difference.
Right, and they'll say some states you pay more once you reach $17,000 of income.
Right,
but,
and so
it goes obviously up, and that's not what Pritzker seems to be talking about.
But they're claiming this week, Republicans were, that there are just not enough rich people in Illinois to actually raise the money in a way that, to pay for the things that Pritzker wants.
Without the middle class getting hit.
Right, exactly. And so, it's not like Democrats need Republicans. It's not like they were counting on Republican votes. But the United Front from Republicans does present some of a hurdle. They are going to be organized. They're also, there are definitely huge interest groups who are going to be working against this, as well as interest groups who are going to be working for it. But
Kent loves these groups, sometimes called dark money groups, because he's an expert on these things.
Yes, but I just think it's really interesting to me that Republicans are trying to. I mean, they've always said we're not going to go with this, obviously. Right. But they are still trying to work with the governor on other things, right. And I think that's a major statement.
Yeah, and it's possible that they think this will also help. There's always a next election because people will be filing for the 2020 election already before the end of this year, and because in the House you're elected every 2 years, and maybe if an opposition builds up to the progressive tax that the governor and the Democrats will push, that they may think they can get some more Republicans elected. Of course, you mentioned 44 Republicans in the House. That means there's 74 Democrats. That's how big the. So, Kent, you think this will be easy to pass? Clearly not bipartisan, it looks like.
No, but the governor's people, and we, at the moment, it seems the Democratic leaders are on board. The maximum political capital the governor has is now.
Right.
And if you put
and
this
he spent some on the minimum wage. They got that passed.
Right. And he's got a capital bill in his back pocket that has the potential of making lots of people happy. We have to pay for it, but everybody's in favor of spending money in their district. But, this is the time you've got maximum political capital. And so you want to go out and they want to lock it in to put the vote out there. They don't want to give the Manufacturers Association and all those groups 12 months to work on a roll call. They want something to happen this spring. They can lose 3 people in terms of their majority. Now, again, the progressive...
they need 71 votes in the House, is what you're saying.
And progressive income tax is popular in a general sense. So should the rich pay more? Now, there's not going to be anything specific in what the people are voting on. The people are going to vote on removing the prohibition against a graduated income tax. Then the legislature, represented by the people who have been elected in 2020, will decide whether or not we're going to have a progressive income tax if the constitutional amendment passes, and what exactly the content of that would be in terms of the brackets. We really don't know at this point what the language would even look like on the constitutional amendment. At least I haven't seen anything
I'm guessing
specific.
It'll be simple because it's just the 1970 Constitution of Illinois just says it must be flat.
Well, but are we going to say, we just take it out and say you can have an income tax and you've got to be fair about it, or are we going to say it must be progressive? I mean, we really don't know what the language is going to look like. Mm-hmm. There's right now that you cannot have the ratio between the flat tax on corporations exceed the flat tax on individuals by a ratio of more than 8 to 5. Mm-hmm. What do you do with that concept in a progressive tax? So the actual language will be interesting, but the voters will be voting on whether or not to allow the legislature to vote on something.
Right. But Governor Pritzker has said he wants an idea of what those brackets are to be part of the debate this year. But of course they could change that because that law could change at any time.
Definitely
once it's out there.
Binding. But none of what Pritzker is doing in his budget in terms of pensions, in terms of a whole bunch of other things, makes sense in the 2-year bridge to something. Well, the something is a progressive income tax. We're not doing a progressive income tax so we can raise the same amount of money we would have raised under the flat tax. So that very ambitious plan that the governor has in place, all of it does, it's all towards having this progressive income tax.
Right.
I don't know how many times in his budget address last week that he kept bringing up the progressive income tax. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like he's building towards something, like Kent said, that he doesn't know yet if it's, he of course hopes and believes that it'll pass, but he doesn't know yet if it will.
Right.
And gosh, by the time that happens, he'll be, that'll be 2 years into his term.
Right.
And he's got to have to, one of the criticisms of Governor Rauner, apart of course from the whole budget impasse, was that by the time that he was seeking re-election, there was not very much to show for it. Mm-hmm. And so Pritzker might face that same problem. Of course, he has the advantage of a capital bill, but again, capital bill.
And there was the minimum wage, which the Democratic legislature pushed through rather quickly, which was many years in the works. So.
Yeah, but I mean, there's a lot riding on his idea for a progressive income tax.
Kent, we mentioned dark money groups, and that's the negative way to look at them. People who don't have to report where they get their money from, but certain kinds of nonprofit educational groups, they call them, which run ads. And one grows out of, is being led by Greg Bays, the former president and CEO of the Illinois Manufacturers Association, called Ideas Illinois, calling a progressive tax a jobs tax. It'll hurt Illinois. It'll keep companies from coming, drive, people to leave the state and take their money with them. On the other hand, Governor Pritzker said he is funding another group called Think Big Illinois, which is kind of a campaign theme that he had. We do big things, because he was a little making fun of, he's a husky person. But, and that is basically saying, they call it a fair tax. So we're going to see perhaps, and we've started to see some ads, and that's, again, you look at those things, but we don't exactly know where the money's coming from. But we kind of know that it's going to be unions and Governor Pritzker on the side pushing the fair tax, and business interests like the manufacturers and people associated with certain business groups, pushing the jobs tax like it's a terrible thing.
This could heat up very quickly. If we're trying to get a roll call before the 30th of June, then... Of
May actually, because the legislature's supposed to end in May these days.
Yeah, depending on, they're depending on, but we're going to try and get a roll call this spring, then everybody that is tired of the campaign in the fall, and tired of the campaign for, municipal elections in the city of Chicago, could be hit with another campaign, wall-to-wall TV commercials.
I have a solution. Watch public TV. Okay. All right.
Please.
So,
there you go.
The never-ending campaign may have just gotten a lot longer.
Right. One of the more immediate problems, even though Governor Pritzker said he wants to get this constitutional amendment at least set so that it will be on the coming ballot in 2020, is this year's budget. Fitch Ratings and I think some other ratings agencies have looked at the governor's plan. I think both of you have some knowledge of this, and say there are some one-time infusions of cash. It may not do enough in the ratings agency's view to help Illinois as much as ought to be.
Right. So both Fitch Ratings, Inc. out of New York, and I guess they're all, the big ones are based out of New York, and then Standard & Poor's, S&P came out Friday, so that was 2 days after the governor's address, Fitch on Tuesday, and neither of them are especially giddy about the governor's budget proposal. I think it's probably also the ratings agency's job is to, give warnings. They don't always act. I mean, I looked at the history and I made myself a little chart to make sure I'm always keeping track of where we are. But Fitch, they hadn't actually downgraded Illinois since 2 years, February of 2017. And that was, 6 months before the impasse broke. And so Fitch has us 2 notches below or above junk status. S&P and Moody's have us 1 notch. But Fitch seemed especially wary because, part of the governor's proposal is this 5-pronged plan to take care of pension liabilities, and he does it in a way that, when I asked him about it, he was like, why are you focusing on this part? It's 5 parts. But it is worrying because Illinois has a recent history of pension holidays and a long-term history of just not paying enough into the pension
and one thing he
system.
wants to do is extend
Yes.
what the pension ramp to get us to 90% funded for liabilities or whatever from 2045 to 2052, extended 7 years, and so the rating agencies don't look good on that. Kent, as a professor, how much impact do these ratings have as long as we've been talking about this for a minute?
It's important because it has an impact on what we pay to borrow money. And the rate, when your rating is as low as Illinois, you pay the highest rates. You often pay premiums in terms of your bond issues. We want to borrow money to pay down some of the unpaid bills. We want to borrow some more money to put into the pension fund directly, and interest rates are low, so you can make an economic argument for that. But we're definitely paying a lot more than a state that has a very high credit rating. And so if the governor would have come in and said, I'm going to raise the income tax by 1 percentage point, and I'm going to take all that money and put it in the pension fund, and I'm going to put it to pay off the unpaid bills, the rating agencies would say, terrific, that really helps, and we're going to upgrade your rating,
bonding, right.
and we would have been able to borrow money, which we always have to do short term, and borrow money for a capital bill at a better rate.
But
So-
politically, it's a horrible thing to do because everybody's mad at you for raising taxes.
Yes, yes. There are no good ways to dig our way out of this mess, and so they are. The rating agencies view this as not being positive, but they're unlikely to put us to junk status because we can all of us sell our bonds. Illinois is not going broke.
And at least, they did, I think from what I read just a bit, they're at least happy that we don't have this dysfunction in state government. You have a Democratic governor and Democratic legislature. We know they're going to work together to do something, so it's better than the uncertainty of the last 4 years with the Republican governor and Democratic legislature at loggerheads where they went 2 years without a budget. We just have a little bit of time left, but Governor Pritzker, he trashes President Trump a lot. He did during the campaign, and yet he went to the National Governors Association meeting in Washington. He was among new governors meeting with President Trump. President Trump singled him out, didn't seem to remember his name, but said, "Hey, how you doing, my friend?" They know each other as billionaires, I guess. And Pritzker was also named to the Council of Governors to advise the feds on security issues, disaster response. And Trump says, "Oh, you have an easy state." And Pritzker says, "Oh, we know you're going to help me." So good relations like this, I guess they can't hurt, right?
Well, and the fact that the governor and the president are talking to each other is a good thing. We made a big deal noting that the governor of Illinois sat down with the congressional
leader. He met with the entire congressional delegation, and most of them were there, which is different.
Rauner never did.
That's right. Well, on that positive note, Hannah Meisel, thank you. Kent Redfield, thank you. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.